Excellent. Good morning, everybody. And thanks again to the organisers of the event for the invitation, and of course for putting such an amazing couple of days together. I'm always fascinated to listen to people working in cryptography, and in fact, in the last chapter of my book on blockchains and the emerging contours of international trade, I talk about the importance of zero-knowledge proofs potentially as a strategy to address some of the potential barriers in cross-border data movements. So I think that there is significant real-life applications for zero-knowledge proofs in overcoming some of the emerging challenges arising from the changing geopolitical landscape of the world. But I'm going to talk about something quite different today. And hopefully it'll be a little bit of an opportunity maybe to relax a little bit after some pretty heavy going technical discussions earlier. And what I want to discuss is this idea of how groups of human beings continue to, in a sense, seek to reinvent ways of solving old problems. And maybe it says something a little bit more about how we are, as human beings, thrust into a world that seems to have the same problems throughout the centuries, and we're constantly looking at ways of solving them. And how some of the historical experiences that we've had can actually shed some light on the ways that we're tackling problems today, and perhaps even help fast track some of the implementation pathways. And I'm talking particularly about the recent explosion in interest in this idea of DAOs. It seems that over the last 4 or 5 years in particular, DAOs have really landed on our sort of cultural map. Lots of people from lots of areas of life are talking about this idea of distributed autonomous organisations as mechanisms by which we can coordinate and collaborate amongst networks of people, particularly using distributed ledgers as a way of enabling coordination in trustless, relatively anonymous environments. We know that DAOs as a technology has experienced some challenges as well in their early days, which in some ways is par for the course, but in other ways also perhaps opens up some of the primitive issues involved in what DAOs are trying to do and how it is that human beings ultimately interact. So I guess I have a fairly generic understanding, if you will, of DAOs as a general class of things. A bit like, and I'll talk a little bit about philosophy, which may not be something that is necessarily a core focus of many people in the room, but a philosopher called Wittgenstein described this idea of familial similarity. So the idea that there's a bunch of things that are kind of belonging to a family of things without necessarily being identical to each other. And there's lots of variations on the theme, if you will, about DAOs. And in many ways, for mine, they're ways of multiple groups of people seeking to use particular instruments or tokens to enable them to carry and exercise certain kinds of participatory and decision-making rights. In other words, to be able to have a say. Right? So DAOs are a way in which distributed groups of people, agents, get to have a say about some common agreed objective and purpose. And when you look through all of the DAO projects around the place, it seems that there are at least 7 common elements to them all, to varying degrees of complexity and adoption and emphasis. And these 7 guiding principles are these. It seems that all DAOs are geared towards creating a community where every member can benefit equitably. So this idea of self-help, right, that groups of people can come together to help themselves and to help each other. That seems to be a very common thread across the DAO space. Central to the DAO ethos is also the idea that the participants are responsible within the network. So they have a sense of being having self-responsibility. No one else can make them responsible for what they do as members of this organisation or network, and they need to exercise their role, if you will, and contribute to the network without any particular powerful motivation or incentive other than the benefit of this particular purpose of this network itself. One of the foundational threads of DAOs also seems to be this idea of democracy, right? The idea of democratising decision making so that the participants are able to have a lot of control over how decisions are made or resources are allocated or whatever, and that no single individual within a network has more power over others. Right? So members of these networks can exercise their right to have a say, basically through some kind of a voting mechanism. There's also a strong sense that members of these networks are equal. So this is quite distinct, and I guess a reaction to the emergence and the strong influence role of, I guess, what we've come to euphemistically describe as whales within the cryptocurrency space. And that is again a desire to bring decision making back to the ground so that not a small group of people with lots of resources get to tell everyone else what to do. And it's in part a cultural reaction to this explosion of whales and crypto oligarchs in an environment where the promise was actually the opposite. So when cryptocurrencies really started to gain traction in the early 2010s, a very strong guiding idea about them was that somehow they would enable people, ordinary people, to have a greater say over the affairs of their financial life. Equity is an important dimension as well, and that is that all members are treated equally. So there's no discrimination between one participant in a DAO network over another one. And the last guiding principle seems to be this idea that the members have this shared interest in this organisation and its purposes, and are really there to contribute, in a sense, a collective effort towards some common goal. And just about all DAOs seem to have these 6 things in one shape or another. So I guess in a generalised sense, DAOs are a kind of digitalised membership-based organisation or an association of people that aim to pool participants' resources and then make democratic decisions about how those resources are used to achieve some stated purpose of the DAO in question. Whether it's pooling essentially money into a pot and then making democratic decisions about how that money is used, or whatever it happens to be. And so I've kind of thought about maybe a way of formalising a general description of what DAOs are. And this description seems to be reasonable to work with, at least for now, which is that DAOs are an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise, or in effect through a jointly owned and controlled application that enables them to exercise these functions of coming together voluntarily and pursuing some of their joint interests. And when they do that, and this might help as people think about how to develop their thinking around decision making and collective decision making is that in effect they have to resolve three fundamental design questions when it comes to decision making and governance. And all groups of human beings actually need to do this when they come together to do things collectively and coordinate their efforts. The first one is that decisions have to be made about what it is that we make decisions about. So what are we concerned about in this particular network or this particular DAO or this particular association? What are the things that matter to us that we're going to be making decisions about? The second one is who gets to make these kinds of decisions and who is involved in making decisions about different things. And an organisation may choose to require that all members make decisions about everything that that organisation may be required to make decisions about, or it may ultimately develop more hierarchical ways of structuring classes of decisions so that some decisions require more people to be involved in and others less. And that comes to questions that an organisation may have that are both philosophical and practical around the significance of certain decision types and the extent to which decisions about those things matter to the overall purpose of the association. And the last thing that decisions need to get made about is the hows. What are the rules that certain decisions and groups of people need to satisfy for those decisions to be valid? Right, so how is it that we go about making a decision about things? So these are sort of abstract ideas around decision-making design that seem to be very, very common in the way that DAOs are trying to grapple with this idea of distributed participatory decision-making. We've actually played around with a few things ourselves, mainly for research purposes, and for us, one of the primitives in all of this is multi-sigs, which is really a way for us to educate participants around designing and thinking about those three core questions that I described. And you can have a bit of a play with it. It's on Polygon, and it's pretty clunky. The front end's hopeless. We're really hopeless at front end stuff. It never looks particularly good, but it kind of works. And it suits our research purposes in trying to flush out and help people think about the issues at stake when they are actually designing real projects. So far I've talked a lot about a sort of a general theory, if you will, about what DAOs are and what they seek to accomplish and what are the common themes about them. And for many people, DAOs are a very new thing, right? I can't remember the first DAO, when the DAO was first deployed. Was it 2016, 2017, 2018, something like that. Frankly, the last 3 years have totally caused me to lose any sense of time at all, you know. But sometime in the last 6 or 7 years was, you know, the first DAO, which caused all that controversy and ultimately led to, you know, a pretty significant fork in the Ethereum community. But you know what? These ideas about DAOs and the things that we're trying to do with them are as old as the hills. And in fact, I'd suggest that formalised collective decision-making protocols have been around for well over 1,000 years. And in very significant senses, continue to play their role in social and economic life today. So membership-based organisations include things like guilds, where merchants and craft workers actually set up collectives around the 12th century in Europe. So that's 1,000 years ago, where groups of people decided on who could participate, that second question, the who. They decided on why they all came together, which was what the issues were that mattered to them. And then they resolved how they were going to marshal their new collective capacities to pursue their common purposes. So guilds is actually an antecedent to this idea of DAOs. Chinese merchant guilds go back at least 500 years as well, and probably even longer, but to again achieve not dissimilar things, which is to create common platforms and infrastructure and services that would support certain classes of people to go about their businesses that often had a lot of commonalities as well. We also have cooperatives. Cooperatives go back probably only 160 odd years or so, and in a formal sense. And the historical literature tends to date the formation of the first formalised cooperative society as 1844, which is this group of men who came together to form this cooperative society, the Rochdale Pioneers. And you can look that up. Ultimately, lots of cooperatives eventually were formed and have been formed and continue to exist. And in 1895, an International Cooperative Alliance was established. And that organisation continues to operate today. So again, there's some very interesting historical antecedents to what it is that we're trying to do in a technical environment around this idea of self-governing communities and DAOs. And the International Cooperative Alliance ultimately refined some core operating principles. And they published and continue to advocate, and it's the central organising principles of cooperatives around the world, 7 principles. I actually described 6 of them earlier. Because those 6 principles that I described earlier, in terms of what I think DAOs are in large part like, are actually exactly what the 7 principles of cooperatives actually are. So immediately we can see that even though we have come to DAOs from a very different perspectives from this group of men, for example, the ways in which we are trying to organise ourselves as self-governing communities with shared interests and democratic decision-making and all those sorts of things are actually things that others have thought about a lot over the years and actually have come up with a lot of sensible answers to how we tackle the problems of collective social decision-making and self-governance. And my suggestion, I guess, here is not to say that there are formulas for any of this, but that sometimes it's often worthwhile when we're thinking through a DAO, for example, and a DAO project, and we confront some challenges, that in fact we're not the first group of people who've faced these challenges. And we might find some guidance from the work of human beings and human societies over the last few hundred years, at least. So I'd suggest and recommend to you all to look up the International Cooperative Alliance and actually get to understand what they try to do as a way of thinking about what DAOs could be. Another interesting one is mutuals. So cooperatives and mutuals are often mentioned in the same breath. And mutuals are member-owned organisations in which people come together to meet their shared needs. And they typically work on the basis that they are membership-driven, which is that the members of this association are also the users of its services. Okay, so these mutuals got created as a response to the needs of the members. They're democratically governed in the sense that every member has a vote. So they're very different from a stock company, which is driven by the idea that the number of shares actually dictates the proportionality of say, if you will. All members of mutuals have the same amount of say. So these mutuals or friendly societies have existed for about 300-400 years, and possibly a little bit longer. Classic mutuals are actually insurance schemes. So it's often interesting to see that in the DeFi space, we start to talk about insurance and insurance pools and decentralised insurance pools and those sorts of things. And the truth is that we've been operating, in effect, distributed insurance pools for 400-500 years. And the history of insurance actually tells us something quite interesting about this. And insurance actually has 2 main histories. One is from Lloyd's of London. And Lloyd's of London, was actually named after a coffee shop where a group of rich men would meet near the docks, and they would bet on whether particular ships would make it back. And then the people who would win the bets would obviously clean out the pool. And those who lose the bets, of course, lost their money to those who won the bets. It actually wasn't insurance at all. But insurance, maritime insurance that came up through Lloyd's, was actually a gambling game between gentlemen. The other history or certainly the Western history to insurance is actually from the Swiss Alps. And it's not surprising that a lot of the major insurance organisations in the world are domiciled in Switzerland. And what happened in the Swiss Alps was that groups of cattle graziers in villages eventually came to the view that it made sense for them to create these insurance pools by pooling money, which could be drawn upon by any member who put money into the scheme to replace the loss of cattle. So cattle would fall off the side of the hills and disappear and get injured and die and all those sorts of things. And these original insurance pools was actually so that there was money there for a farmer to go and replace the lost animals in the herd. And again, that required deciding on who could participate, what it is that they were coming together to achieve, and how that pool of money was to be allocated and what the rules were. Unsurprisingly, these are the same kinds of issues that DAOs and DeFi protocols seek to address. Associations is another classic. And in Australia, for example, we have a myriad of associations, some big, some small, and they can be incorporated or unincorporated. And one of the key things of the incorporation possibilities of insurance, of associations, is that it provides, in effect, the benefits of limited liability, so that the individual members have a limited liability to the consequences of decisions made by the association itself. And this idea of limited liability, and through this idea of creating a legal personality that has its own existence, is actually part and parcel of how these other forms of social organisation have evolved through time, so that the participating members, so long as the rules are being followed, are individually not liable for any particular downsides or adverse events that happen as a result of the actions and decisions of the association itself. And these things are important to think about because part of the confusion and frustration in the distributed DAO space is the idea of what are these things and how are they to be addressed at law. And my suggestion is that there's actually one fundamental question here that people are interested in, and that is whether they can have limited liability or not. That is the only thing that really matters. Everything else is sort of window dressing and all of that. But the reason why people are interested in limited liability is because they want to be protected as individuals in the event that something goes wrong. That's what that's all about. Because without that protection, there's a strong disincentive for people to actively get involved in the decision-making processes and all those sorts of things, because individually they become liable. So the idea of incorporation is actually a very important one to think about. Just to give you a sense that these organisational forms aren't sort of bizarre historical leftovers, and that they actually play very important roles in economic life. Here's just a little bit of data on mutuals and co-ops in Australia, just Australia alone. There's 1,800 or so mutuals and co-ops active today in Australia, with a combined membership of about 32 million people. 8 in 10 Australians are members of at least one co-op or cooperatively mutually owned organisation. How many of you are a member of RACV? Hands up? No one? How many of you have industry superannuation? you go. Industry super is actually the biggest group of mutually owned businesses or organisations or asset owners and controllers in the world, in Australia. Australia's top 100 co-ops and mutuals have a combined turnover of over 34 billion Australian dollars. That's not peanuts. With collectively held assets of $188 billion. Again, not peanuts. So these forms of social organisation not only have a long history where they've had to resolve a lot of problems going along the way, but as a result of having this long history, they've been able to establish a level of resilience and sustainability where they actually play very important roles in economic life. As a result of that, of course, there's also a long-standing legal and regulatory tradition. And I'll just touch on some of this. I'm not going to go through any of this in detail, but I mention it because, again, my suggestion is that as we think about DAOs and want to develop DAOs and are inspired by the sort of ethos of DAOs and all those things, and then we get concerned about whether there's a legal framework that we could nestle our work in, I'd suggest that a good starting point is actually the laws that govern clubs and associations and cooperatives and mutuals. And if we start to think about DAOs as a set of technical tools that give effect to legal incorporated forms of membership-based organisations, then we might not be so confused about the right regulatory environment, and in fact can move forward with a lot of confidence that what we're doing in a technical environment is actually just part and parcel of a long-standing social, economic and regulatory experience. And that should give us some heart, because one of the concerns that people have had in recent times is lack of regulatory certainty. And I'd suggest, and I've had discussions with many legal colleagues, particularly those in financial services, that in fact this set of arrangements, the laws governing mutuals and co-ops and those sorts of things, is actually a better starting point for projects working in distributed ledger technologies as a regulatory environment than anything else. And in fact, we don't really need to reinvent the wheel. We need to explore how existing regulatory arrangements can be exploited, so to speak, in the aid of new technologies, but also how new technologies can be mobilised in the name of making these more traditional forms of organisations work better and more effectively. Because ultimately they all share a set of common problems as well. And I'll just mention three of them, because it doesn't matter what kind of self-governing organisation we seem to have invented over the centuries. Three things seem to bug them all the time. One is ultimately low participation. When I look at the experiences of DAOs and blogs and the chat rooms and all of that, one of the big frustrations is turnout, participation. That's okay. DAOs aren't the first voluntary social organisation to experience this, and it is a perennial problem. And there may be something we can learn from how other organisations have tried to tackle these problems that we can mobilise in the context of DAOs. The second problem with self-governing organisations is that whilst they're notionally open to all the participating, there seems to be a tendency for small groups of people to ultimately run them anyway, even if everybody has the same say. And it's because they're small groups of people get really passionate about something, they become essentially insiders, they know how the rules work, and they can start to, in a sense, exploit their energy and enthusiasm against the apathy of low turnout to ultimately take control of these organisations, notwithstanding the design intent, which is to not enable oligarchies to emerge. And the third challenge in these kind of organisations is, as a result of these first two things, is the slow ossification of these organisations. How do you maintain continual life and enthusiasm and a joie de vivre of participation, because ultimately, if these mechanisms and forms of organisation are about enthusing people to play active roles in governing resources that impact them and impact the things that they collectively care about, then it's vitally important that somehow we're able to build new levels of enthusiasm, cultivate an ethos where people have both the capacity and the ability to participate in organisational leadership so that we don't get oligarchies emerging, and also to bring fresh blood into these organisations so that they don't ossify. And maybe, I only threw this in because it was on the template actually, but then I left it because I thought, sometimes in talking to guys who are involved in this space, it's partly also about this sense that there are better ways of doing things that are more collegiate, more collaborative, more open, and ultimately if those things actually happen, maybe it also creates something that's a little bit more relaxing and less intense as well. So I guess the take-out message from this little journey today into the history of human social organisations is that the things that DAOs and people involved in DAOs are interested in and are inspired by and are trying to do are actually not new. Maybe that's a little bit of a downer because I think sometimes we like to think that we're doing new things all the time. But in saying that, my point is that we've actually got a lot to lean on in terms of the human experience. And we can draw from that a whole bunch of experiences and lessons and tools that might actually help us convert the aspirations of technically enabled distributed autonomous organisations into meaningful contributions to social, cultural and economic life. Thanks very much, and I hope you continue to have an excellent day here at the summer school.
Thanks, Warwick, for
presentations, and this is very mind-blowing about the correlations between our current social structures and the DAOs. So my question today is, how do individuals, including the professors, in the cryptocurrency communities envision the role of DAOs in shaping the futures of social structures? And to what extent do they believe DAOs have the potential to create new type of social structures derived from advanced technology on privacy and distributed networks, versus simply being an implementation of technologies within our existing social structures like public corporates, public companies and state government? Thank you.
I think there was about 6 questions there, but I'm going to cheat a little bit and perhaps just touch on something that perhaps applies generally across them, and then we can, well, let's see how I go. I really should have written it down. The idea of self-governing organisations is the fundamental essence, if you will, of what all these discussions are about. And it is about ways in which groups of people, whoever they happen to be, somehow come to the view that they have enough in common, whether it's things that they care about or that they have some resources that can be combined effectively to do something with. And that they want to be responsible for how those things are done. And this is the idea of mobilising a governance principle, which is subsidiarity. And the idea of subsidiarity is for decision-making to be pushed to the levels at which it is closest to the impacts and to those who are impacted by those decisions. And at a macro level, those examples that I suggested, really, we go from a mutual fund and an insurance, which is now dealing with billions of dollars worth of assets on the one hand, very big, to a university association of students aimed at pursuing certain things, or an industry association that's an advocacy group or whatever. And I think the ethos that we need to encourage is the idea that it is possible for people to form self-governing associations and to have a set of tools and ways of going about doing it that are relatively easy for them to. And perhaps, and this is always my frustration, and maybe it's because there are many things that I'm actually hopeless at, and one of them is making information easily accessible and all of that. But what I'd love to see is almost a menus-driven tool to say, look, there's a group of people. You want to co-organise something, and here's almost like a template journey that you can walk through. How do you want to do this? What do you want to do? What are the questions you want to resolve? Da 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 da. And you can actually pop out, firstly, a set of organisational rules that can be registered. So if you can create and incorporate association, that's one. And in that set of written rules is actually the specifications for your smart contracts to give effect to them. So these are the rules that we're going to be governed by, and this is how we're going to enable us to do that. In the old days, we used to have a thing called a general meeting. You had to turn up in person, for example. That killed participation. Nothing more boring, than turning up to a general meeting, sitting there in rows, and all that sort of stuff. There might be other ways in which we can enliven a general meeting. Through decision-making procedures and practices and technologies. But the key to it, whatever these things happen to be, is to continue to explain to people that they actually do have the capacity to take charge of a lot of things in their immediate life. And that there is a regulatory environment that actually makes that entirely possible. And perhaps the one thing I would say is this, and I don't want this to come across necessarily the wrong way, but it probably will. What I've found in many societies, and particularly I've experienced this in Australia, is that when something happens that we don't like about something, what's the first question that most people seem to ask? What's the government doing about it? It's always the first one. What's the government doing about it? And often, well, governments may or may not be able to do something about something. Who knows? Case by case. But perhaps the first question we have to start asking is, actually, what can we do about it? Well, we're all affected by this, so what is it that we can do about something before even asking that other question? Because we might actually solve something better, quicker, cheaper, and enable us to get on with things by going down the route of self-organising associations and communities than it is to say, will someone come and solve this for me? So I know I didn't quite touch on all the aspects of your question, but I think underpinning all of that is the idea of, is a culture of participatory activism as individuals, where we actually become passionately interested in something. It can be one thing, it can be 10 things, or whatever it happens to be, that floats our boat, and then to find others who share those passions. And by finding others who share those common passions, e-commerce used to be the long tail, right? But now it's about finding those, long tails, if you will, of whatever the passions happen to be. It could be buying things, collecting things. It doesn't worry me what they are. But what's remarkable is that we might all be individuals, but funnily enough, we also flock in groups that have, as Wittgenstein say, groups with familial similarity.